All right, welcome everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. We got a lot to unpack today. It'll probably take all of the available time we have today on our webinar. We've got a great one for you today. Today is the commercial building codes and commissioning. As always, today's webinar is being recorded. It will be uploaded to YouTube shortly after, probably within about 3 or 4 days, just after some editing. You can go to our YouTube channel by searching SPEAR on YouTube, or you can go directly to our website at eepartnership.org, and under our news section, you'll find our resources page. Once you're on that resource page, you'll find a link to our YouTube channel. We've got over 150 videos on there, most of them from our Energy Codes program and the training that we've got going through there. It spans a few years back with a lot of different topics. Today's webinar is eligible for ICC CEUs, but you must be present for at least 3/4 of the presentation. Within about 72 hours, you're going to receive a course evaluation survey email from Kathy Lawrence. Once you complete that and return it to her, she'll send you a certificate that will include the title of the course and the course ID number that you'll need when reporting your CEUs to ICC. Lastly, as always, I have the chat feature open. Report any technical difficulties or ask questions if you'd like in that. And also I've got the Q&A open as well, so you can ask questions in that as well. We'll probably wait till the end and go through it unless I read the question and seem that we need to stop and ask Jerry a question, but we'll probably wait till the end to go through that. For any of you that are new to the SPEAR YouTube training channel, what we do and what we can do is we're a nonprofit. We're what's considered a RIO, a Regional Energy Efficiency Organization. We cover Texas and Oklahoma. As you see here, there's other RIOs throughout the country that covers a lot more states than we do, but we have a vast territory with Texas and Oklahoma. So we are member-based. Our best that we do is outreach for education, collaboration on clean energy, and advancement and adoption of the Energy Code. What we can do is provide training, webinars, in-person, field training, as well as I can also do one-on-one IECC test prep if you've got anybody out there looking to get certified. The price is always right. It's free. We don't charge for what we do. I can help with answer questions regarding any Energy Code version that's out there that you may have adopted in your city. We can also help with ASHRAE 90.1. I can also help answer questions with plan reviewers, building officials, third-party inspector questions as well. Happy to help in any way that I can. We still continue to assist cities with the adoption of Energy Code. I used to just always say with the 21, the 24 is now out, and there are cities that are looking to adopt the 24. So what we can help with is navigate any additional amendments that may be proposed. It can help lessen the impact of the adoption in your area. My contact information will be at the end of this presentation. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions. I'd love to help you navigate through the Energy Code. So we have today Jerry Kettler. He is with us today to give us a great deep dive into building code, commercial building codes, and commissioning. So Jerry, the floor is yours. I will stop sharing and let you take over.
Okay. You got it? All right. Next one. That's the title here, Building Codes and Commissioning. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Sort of a new subject for a lot of folks. That's me, and not sure what city that is, but it's commissioning involves a lot of things that we're going to be talking about today. That's in the past not really considered as part of that process. Next. Okay, but why are we doing this? Well, commissioning is a new process, sort of, in the building world. We've been building buildings, not those of us in the program here, but we've been building buildings for over 5,000 years. But most of those weren't commissioned in the old days. So we're talking about a new process that basically started in the 1990s, or excuse me, in the 80s and evolved into the 90s and later. Sets, various different things that you need to do to make a building operate properly. And we'll go over a lot of the details here. So what we're going to do today is talk about the various model building codes, what's involved in commercial. We're not talking about residential today at all. This is going to be commercial. Although some of these things, or many of these things, can be done in the residential world. And we're going to go over the commissioning process. What is it? how do you do it, or how does the commissioning provider do it, and what kind of records and what kind of plans do we need for that? Then the codes have adopted this because they understand how important and how useful the commissioning process is. But there's an enforcement process. Anything in a code is in an enforcement process, and we'll go over some of that and give you some hints on some other areas that are books that you might get. Then we're going to talk about what the commissioning provider, or who's doing the commissioning or managing it, is doing, and what qualifications they should have. Next. So, why does this matter? Why are we concerned about commissioning? It's required in many codes and standards, and the building designs and constructions is a lot more complex. When I started in the design and construction area, the air conditioning system was controlled by pneumatic air pressure. And none of the building systems, or virtually none of them, were tied together. So they didn't operate together. That's no longer true. All the electronics that we've invented over the last 30 or 40 years are now being put in buildings. And those various systems have to talk to each other. What we find in the construction world, even today, is that the various installers of a system, they install their system and then leave. They don't even talk to the other folks putting in other systems. So somebody has to make everybody test everything and connect everything so that it works the way it's supposed to. So what we end up with is a better organized and functional performance system, or performance inspection. And the functional performance and performance testing, actually there's 3 levels of this kind of testing, or functional stuff. The first is, and let's use the light fixture as an example. First of all is existence. Is it there? Is a light fixture installed? Second, does it function? And you turn it on. And third, performance, does it put the right amount of light on the table? So this is true of a lot of other things that are in the buildings. Now there are increased requirements, environmental requirements, performance requirements, and they're getting more and more complex. The energy performance started out being emphasized in codes in the 1980s after the energy crisis in the 80s. And lately, some of our health issues with COVID and that are requiring, or at least demonstrating, the fact that the building itself should be a good place to be. And in fact, they've done a lot of research. The ones that done in Harvard are particularly interesting. They've proved that from unacceptable air, unventilated or whatever air, to really good air, the performance of all of the people in the building goes up. So that's must be effect of something. So what we're trying to do here is make those systems work right. And in fact, their research indicated that some of the performance levels of the people in the space increased by nearly 300%. So we're talking about something that's very valuable for things in buildings. And the requirements and codes and laws keep increasing because of all of this. Next. So let's talk about the building codes and standards. We're going to concentrate today on the ICC codes, because most of the people are using that, but there are other areas that use other codes, many of which include commissioning. But the items in red here are the ones that require specifically commissioning and state that, and we'll go over those areas. Building code, of course, they're supported by the mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and they mention quality but not commissioning per se in the other codes. And the energy code follows that we're talking about the 2021 energy code. It's based on the ASHRAE 90.1, 2019. So the compliance option for the is for the ICC. The next item that city of Dallas has adopted, and then some of the other cities are thinking about it or looking at it, is the green code. And we were talking about the 2021 International Green Construction Code, or IGCC. It's also based on an ASHRAE standard. It's ASHRAE 189.1, standard for design of high performance green buildings. So those are all getting more connected together. There are also sustainability programs. We're not going to get into great detail on those, but the LEAD program, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, probably is the one that been around longest, at least in the United States, and utilizes commissioning. And there are other systems that we're not going to talk about, including well and fit well in those. But if anybody has any questions about those, let me know. Send me an email, and I'll be glad to talk to give you the information. But again, the things in red, these are all mentioning things or requiring things in commissioning. Next. So what's commissioning? What's its definition? Well, it started out as a quality-focused process for enhancing the delivery of a project. That's basically what it boils down to. The process focuses on verifying and documenting that all commissioned systems and assemblies, here we're talking about the fact that you can commission systems or equipment in a building without commissioning everything. But when you commission it, be sure that they are planned, designed, installed, tested, operated, and maintained to meet the owner's project requirements. That's a bunch. And there are things that we're going to go through here to try to exemplify that and try to, get everybody on the same sheet of music here. Next. So commissioning results. What happens when we do commissioning? Well, first, when you do commissioning, you're figuring out what doesn't work at that point and letting somebody know they can fix it. But you need to do that early enough in the construction process so that it gets fixed before people start moving into the building or using it. So the process here in construction and commissioning operates on various levels and various times of the building function. And what we're talking about today is the construction and process and times at the end of the and during construction that is important to be sure that the building operates properly and meets the codes. So we're looking at building performance and ultimately in the performance of the people in the building, but to do that off quickly enough so that things work right initially. Next. So the commissioning process has various requirements, and most of everything else that we're going to talk about reflects this as a system of things that happened in a certain pattern. But if you think about it, the process of defining requirements, designing it, constructing it, and operating it is pretty much the same. But in this case, we're getting into more detail in commissioning. But we want to be sure that performance documents they contain the information that's needed to be sure that it operates properly. And we'll go over in a minute here who does that and how that's done. But that has to be down. So the process and the requirements must be in the design documents, because that's what the contractor needs to know and understand in order to build it properly. And the commissioning team needs to know how to test it properly. We're trying to figure out whether the design meets the requirements, because we'll do that in a review by the commissioning team, and then that the systems are tested to verify that. And the next thing that has improved drastically in the last few years, last maybe 20 or 30 years, is that the operators of the building are now trained. In the old days, in the simple buildings, you could build a building and then hand the keys to the owner and say, good luck, it's yours. But that doesn't work anymore because buildings are too complex. But all of the things we've been talking about here has to be in documentation and has to be somewhere where the owner an operator can access it. So all of the things, including the testing, all of those records need to be available to the people operating the building. Next. So what are these phases? What are we talking about here? Well, going back, the pre-design, and this is something that owners need to understand, that they're setting up the requirements. What specifically and in detail do they want that particular building or process to do? During pre-design, they need to talk about the commissioning. If they talk about what is in the building or what is the building, that testing of that has to be part of the scope and the budget for that project from the beginning. So the owner needs to understand that commissioning is both beneficial and required, and all of that process is defined throughout the process. So that then goes to the design function, and the design team creates what they call a basis of design, BOD. That answers the owner's project requirements of how the architect and engineer team is going to design the building with what systems and what requirements. And the owner then approves that. And then that helps define the specifications again, so that the owner will approve, and the architect and the engineers will check things and make specific indications that that have to be in the documents, so that the providers, the constructors, the contractors, the suppliers understand what they got to do, both in providing the equipment and in testing it. And then during the design, we're also talking about training, again, so that the people operating the building have a chance to operate it successfully. During construction, the contractor has additional responsibilities. They're normal work, but additional stuff here. We're talking about being sure that the submittals are correct and timely, that the verification and functional testing is done by the contractors. All of this is documented, and in the end ends up in systems manuals, and the contractor does and coordinates the training. Then in occupancy and operations, we're not going to talk about that too much, but the retesting and remodeling, all of this, rest of that. In fact, the Energy Code has a section for existing buildings, which we'll only talk about briefly. But all of that ends together. That's the phases of commissioning, which is essentially the same as the phases of construction and design. Next. So what we're going to talk about here is what some of the basis for that. Commissioning is actually based on ASHRAE Standard 202. The 2018 is the version that this particular Energy Code is based on. It's been reissued lately, but it's the commissioning process for buildings and systems. Next. So what is that process? One of the things to realize in the commissioning process is that each one of the activities in commissioning has a deliverable, has a document, has something that needs to be produced, reviewed, and utilized. When you initiate commissioning, this is again the owner's responsibility. He has to define who's doing what. So the roles and responsibilities have to be defined, and it's best if that is all written down. Again, the owner's project requirements, that's defined by the owner. That's number 2, building requirements. What's it supposed to do? Then the commissioning plan, usually provided by the commissioning provider, can also be done by the owner, but the owner has to approve it. That all goes to the design team, who creates the basis of design we talked about. So that's the design approach to the requirements. Next. So then we get into more to the details. The specifications, which is certainly a written document, that sets the contractor's responsibility for a lot of things, including commissioning. So all of that is reviewed, and we end up with a design review report from the commissioning standpoint. What we find in the practice of commissioning is, since we see so many different kinds of buildings and systems, that we can review a design on a project or building and question things that, oh, by the way, that might not work. And this helps the designers and the owners to only have to build it once. So that commissioning review is very important. Then during the actual contract and commission or contract and building, the submittal process is pretty much the same, but the commissioning provider, that team looks at the submittals to be sure that it meets the owner's project requirements. And everything is going to be satisfying to the owner at the end. Because the owner has the golden rule, he has the gold and he's making the rules. So we have to review these things to be sure they meet the requirement. Then during construction, there's observation and testing, and all of that generates checklists and reports. And we talked earlier about the commissioning plan. These checklists end up in the commissioning plan. And we'll talk more about the commissioning plan here in a little bit. Next. During the construction, you will find things that aren't working the way they're supposed to or that generate questions. It's a program or document called the issues log. It's also at times called issues and resolution log. It lists the issues and things that need to be answered, sometimes by the contractor, often by the designers. So this is a separate document, and it's a document that needs to be retained with the performance information. Then the general contractor usually is the one that collects all of the data, the submittals and the commissioning information and the rest of that. It ends up in a systems manual, which is a fairly complex set of documents that is organized usually in electronic format that provides information for the building operator and the people doing the investigations and all the rest of that, so that it provides information that is needed to operate the building. It provides the records of how it was designed, how it was built, and how it's supposed to operate. Using that information, the building operators then get trained. And that ends up with training plans and records, and all the rest of that needs to be retained, because it's rare that a building will have the same people operating it from opening to whenever it closes. Building totally goes away. I don't know of a building that's, unless it's a temporary building, that's ever operated that way. So after move-in and after certificate of occupancy, there's end of warranty testing and commissioning reports. And we'll talk about there's two levels of commissioning reports at the end. So the process reports all have to be collected along with the other data in the systems manual. Next. So commissioning summary, real quick here, is got to collect everything, all the requirements are defined. The design team and the contracting team and the operators all need to understand what the requirements are. It's integrated in the design nowadays more than it ever has been. Energy use, we talked about, has to meet the code and requirements, and it's going to get so that the building environment has to meet various codes. And that's being more and more important to folks living in these buildings. But everything has to meet the design, which meets the owner's requirements, and it's tested to be sure that it performs that way. And there's records for that. Okay, next. So there's various different titles. Won't spend much time here, but commissioning process is often referred to as CX. Commissioning provider is often referred to as a CXP. So commissioning process commissioning, technical commissioning, pretty much the same thing. Total building commissioning means you commission everything in the building, building enclosure, everything. That's more basically building inspection. And that's seldom done because of cost and time constraints. Retro commissioning is doing commissioning and retesting on an existing building. The folks over on the East Coast and the left coast are requiring buildings to be inspected, and you report the performance of the building. And if it doesn't meet a certain requirement, you have to tune up the building. Well, tune up essentially means retro commissioning. And recommissioning is once a building's commissioned, you do it again. And then you have various requirements on sustainability and resilient systems that depend on the fact that the buildings are operating properly. Next. So commissioning in the I codes. Next. There is a couple of documents you might be interested in if you're involved in utilizing commissioning or enforcing commissioning or rest of that. The International Code Council has a document, a G4, and it was revised in 2018, called a Guideline for Commissioning. This was put together by building officials and the ICC, plus a good number of folks in the commissioning industry, that we got together to put a joint document together that would define and help implement commissioning. There's another document that would be helpful also that's put out by ASHRAE and the commissioning organization that is called the Commissioning Stakeholders Guide. And that has about 50 checklists that everything in commissioning from OPR through building operation has various checklists. All those checklists are available to you from the ASHRAE website once you get the address from that document. So if you're interested in getting more information, a lot of checklists that really help this process, you might try those two documents. Next. So the various relationships here, the codes are stacked up, what I call it stacked up. They're support one another. The International Building Code is probably the oldest one, and it's been around for quite a while, but the mechanical and plumbing and electrical codes support the building code in the various details. The energy code started out in the late 90s, and it supports those basic codes, but it has a special function, just like the energy includes items on mechanical, plumbing, and electrical, because they're all tied together and relate to energy. The green code is more recent than that, and that has probably a better definition and better information on commissioning, which we'll cover here in a minute, that basically implements the things that we need to do to make the building livable on the inside. Next. So the building code, IBC, and we're talking about the 21 versions here, and as Randy said, the 24s are out. There's not an awful lot of, huge amount of changes in the 24, but there are several of them that are important. In that particular code, the building code's commissioning is not specifically defined. But in Chapter 9, in the fire protection life safety area, and that's Section 9, right, they call for special inspection and testing requirements. And it goes on to say proper commissioning of the smoke control and design and its final installed condition. Basically, they're requiring commissioning, but they only vaguely mention the word commissioning. And they basically say later, such commissioning shall be in accordance with a generally accepted engineering practice. And we'll go over that more in detail in a minute. And then you have other terms in their section 1704. Next. Section 17 is special inspection section. And it defines approved agency, in this case, and it's pretty uniform throughout the code system. Objective, competent, and independent from contractor. You don't want the contractor inspecting his own work. Adequate calibrated equipment for the people doing the testing, and experienced and educated personnel. We'll get into more detail of that here in a minute. But 1705 requires periodic special inspection of plumbing, mechanical, electrical. And it has a list of specific items that it wants tested in that chapter. Next. In the mechanical code, commissioning is not defined, but in inspections in 108, it talks about mechanical systems inspection and testing is required to be done by approved agencies that satisfy requirements as to qualifications and reliability. Basically, they're talking about commissioning here. They're not calling it that, but that's what they're calling. Next, the plumbing code does the same thing. Commissioning is not defined, but it talks about the same things, plumbing systems inspected and tested by the improved agencies. So they're moving in that direction. Next. In the IECC, we're going to change over to the energy code now. They have a definition. We've got a series of definitions here that ties things together much better. A lot of these definitions come from the ASHRAE Standard 202 and other ASHRAE documents. It says the definition of commissioning, the process that verifies and documents that selected building systems have been designed, installed, and function according to owner's project requirements and construction documents and to minimum code requirements. That's a bunch. There's a lot of things that are included in that definition. Next. Building envelope performance verification is another one. It's continuous air barrier verification. Again, approved, inspected, and reviewed by the design professional or approved agency. Here they're talking about commissioning providers again, probably. Again, they're talking about the same process that we just went over what commissioning is. What's the construction documents say? Are they accurate? Are they doing what they're supposed to do? Then you inspect the components, and then you write a report of did it perform properly or not. So that we're talking about the same thing for the building enclosure that you would do for the mechanical, electrical, or any other systems that you're commissioning. Next. So building maintenance information and system commissioning in section C408, they're talking about in building operations and maintenance information. Provided to owner in documents. We're talking about specifications, manufacturer's information, how to make that work with programming, and then other installation specifics. And how do you maintain this stuff? How do you operate it? This is all that's needed in order to verify that it is in fact operating. And what they're requiring here also is that the equipment be labeled with a title or publication number of the operation and maintenance manual. In other words, a lot of these operations and maintenance information, particularly on these complex buildings, on systems that are tied together, are really complex and have to be available and have to be used by the people doing the operation and the maintenance. And that's what they're trying to do here, is put everything in an accessible location by operating usually these are computerized, that went from one of our initial projects many years ago. We did all of the systems manual in 3-ring binders, and this was a couple of 3 or 4-story office buildings, and the systems manual was 27 3-inch 3-ring binders. So there's a lot of information that's available, but that's all done electronically on a computer. Next. Maintenance information in C408, mechanical and service water heating systems. The commissioning completion is what their requirement here is. Again, they're talking about the construction documents have to include system operation and the commissioning and completion requirements. The contractor needs to know that going in, so he's got funding and manpower to do that, and the plan. Then the commissioning plan drafted by the commissioning provider prior to permit. So it's something that is part of a permitting process that we'll talk about later that one of the codes specifically requires. And it's something as a building official might want to see, or at least have somebody verify that the plan exists and all of this information is available so that everybody does what they're supposed to do. Then prior to final inspection, the design professional or agency must provide evidence that this was done, provide that the mechanical systems and anything else that has to be commissioned is completed, and that information is provided to the AHJ if requested. Can be a document, simple document from the owner that says, yes, it exists, or from the commissioning provider. But somebody needs to inform the building official that, in fact, all of this testing has been done and it works right. Next. maintenance information, systems commissioning. Again, we've talked about that in a little bit, but in the code section C408 called about commissioning plan. And this is the plan is by the design professional or approved agency. The architects and engineers usually rely on the commissioning provider to provide those. But they plan to include narratives of what activities are there, specific equipment, which systems do you want tested? Because you don't need to test all of them if that's not something that's included in the code or that the owner wants. So with calibrations, the systems, the functions have to be set, the testing conditions, whether it's weather conditions or whatever, have to be decided and listed so that they're done properly. Then measurable criteria. In other words, what are the systems supposed to do to work right? Next. So there are systems that are excluded from commissioning requirement in some of the smaller buildings that what they're requiring from a code standpoint quite often is that you do functional performance testing. In other words, does it work right and does it perform right on virtually any piece of equipment that has to do with energy? But you have to do full commissioning process if it's over 40 tons, 480,000 BTUs per hour from cooling and 600,000 BTUs per hour for heating. That means that a larger building has to follow the entire process. This is probably done on a budgeting basis, that the commissioning process is not cheap, not expensive. It ends up being a very quick payback compared to trying to fix and figure out how to fix things if they're not done organizationally. The other thing that it excludes is systems that serve individual dwelling or sleeping units, like apartments, hotel rooms, and the rest of that. You don't have to do commissioning on those units. It gets really competitive or really repetitive. And sometimes, you know, if it's built properly, and what we recommend is that a few of the units, dwelling units or rooms, are commissioned to be sure that the contractor installed things correctly. And the rest of them were probably about the same. Next. Systems adjusting and balancing. Here we're talking about in C408 that testing and balancing is now required. So not only is commissioning, but testing and balancing to accepted industry standards. And there's, I think, 4 different national standards for testing and balancing. Each outlet and terminal is equipped with a means for balance or mechanical code, and hydronically that the individual heating coils and the rest of that are tested. And then a written balance report is required. Commissioning then reviews that report, be sure that they understand what the testing is and what systems work and don't work, or are balanced or not. And that all is provided to the building official as requested by that particular entity or city. So next. So the functional and performance testing required, again, they're talking about that 408, demonstrate the installation and operation of approved plans and modes of, including all the sequences of operation. Testing, again, everything that's talking to each other, both the equipment and the people, so that all of that works correctly, particularly the control systems. And they're also emphasizing here economizers. So somebody writing the code decided that one of their hot buttons was economizers. So that's listed several places in these codes as economizers. They're often part of the systems that don't work well. Next. You provide at the end of construction and right before occupancy, right before CO, the preliminary commissioning report is published. It's required project before the final inspection. And what often is done is that the commissioning is inspected and recorded, and that goes to the energy inspector. And that energy inspector must inspect the building and then provide documents to the building inspector that then allows them to do the final inspection. This is how their systems work. And then all of that information, the test results and all the rest of that has to go to the building owner so that they have to accept it. And then this is all provided, the reports, by a design professional or approved agency. We found that very seldom do the design professionals get involved in that unless that design group has their own commissioning company or commissioning team. Tests and all the rest of that are included. Then you have a list of itemized deficiencies, things you haven't done yet, or things that don't work right yet. And quite often at the end of construction and right before move-in, there's a great rush to get it finished so people can start moving into the building. So if the things that are still needing to be done and needing to operate properly, if those aren't affecting the function of the building enough to prevent operation, then usually those are done sequentially next. We'll talk about it. So again, if with climate conditions and the rest of that, sometimes you can't test. For example, you can't test heating systems well in the summer and cooling systems well in the winter. All of these results, functional performance tests. So next, at the end of the project, you end up with a final commissioning report. The final commissioning report includes all the information from the preliminary. And it's in the code, it says here, provided to owners within 90 days of project CO. That, to me personally, is not really the way that should be done. It should be done after opposite season testing instead of 90 days. Because, for example, if you test things today, last day of October, for a preliminary, and 90 days, and you haven't tested heating yet, and in 90 days, it's January, that doesn't give you time to test things properly in the other systems. You include the final test and balance report in the final report, all the procedures that you used. It's a very complete bit of information, and all the results of all the functional performance tests in that final report. It's a detailed report. Again, that goes into the systems manual that provides the building operation the information they need to see what was working, how it was working, and how to maintain it. Next. Again, the lighting we talked about a little bit, but the lighting part of the code in C408 was apparently written by somebody else, and the mechanical sections were. So the functional testing of the lighting is required prior to final inspection. Again, same process. Again, design professional or approved agency. And then the things that they specify that you test and commission is occupancy sensors, time switches, daylight information, drawings and OM manuals and reports. What we find in lighting testing, that the controls are the biggest problem, and the programming of those controls and being sure everything's connected is your biggest problem. So it's not the light functions itself, but it's all of the controls and the daylighting and all the rest of that are now being put in buildings for energy savings and comfort of the people in the building. Next. So we talked a little bit earlier about existing buildings, and their chapter 5 in IECC talks about existing buildings. So their C502 talks about additions. If you're doing an addition to the building, it's got to be the same quality and the same requirements as new construction. Alterations, anything you're changing must comply to the new requirements. So new air conditioning, hot water, lighting. If you're putting in new stuff, it's got to comply with the current code. Repairs, not normally required to comply. And the change in occupancy, if the occupancy type changes, then you have to do an IECC compliance, which may require recommissioning. Next. Now, the green code talks about many of the same processes, but in more detail. So the commissioning process, again, is defined quality focused process for enhancing the delivery of a project. Focuses on verifying, documented all of the things that we talked about: planned, designed, installed, tested, and operated. So they're using basically the same definition here, which is good. Next. So it also defines the commissioning provider. We've talked about that a bit. The entity identified by the owner and approved by the AHJ, who manages the commissioning team to implement the building process, building commissioning. So that's important to understand that if you're doing that green code function, then the owner has to approve it and the AHJ has to approve who's doing the commissioning, or at least license or recognize that team. It defines commissioning plan, again, the documents that we talked about, outlining all of the things that you need to do, including what's tested, how it's tested, documentation's required, and the commissioning process. Next. Owner's project requirements we've talked about, but that is defined here as a document that has all of the information, specifies functional requirements. What is everything supposed to do? How is it supposed to be put in order to do what? Including the project goals, and what is it supposed to do? If there are other core requirements like costs, success criteria, training, and all the rest of that needs to be in the owner's project requirements, including the documentation, because the owner may have a documentation system, computerized system, that he wants all the documents placed in at the end. That needs to be listed in the OPR so that everybody knows they got to interface with that particular computer system. Next. Basis of design, again, talking about the design team, talking about concepts. What are you supposed to do? What are the systems supposed to do? How is the design team, the architects and engineers and suppliers, how are they going to meet those requirements with this type of equipment, this kind of connection, this kind of controls that aren't on the design documents yet for the contractor, but this is the way the design team is planning to design the building. And that is then approved by the owner, because occasionally the design team will not know that the owner, if they have other buildings, might be using a different control system or a different mechanical system. And they want that system used, but haven't said that in the OPR. So that's the reason that the basis of design has to be approved by the owner before it starts. And it also cuts down an awful lot of rework time if everybody agrees going through all of the information. Next. Systems manual. Here we've talked a bunch about that. It talks about all of the things that happen in the design and in the construction and the testing. Includes the copy of the OPR, BOD, commissioning plans, and all the rest of that, and has a set of a chapter called Facility Guide and Operations Manual. And here what that is here's the schedule, and here's the set points. Here's the temperature set points. Here's the schedule of building operation. Here's all of the other time requirements for operating and what the results should be in a facility guide, which is then also used by the operators to set all of the equipment and set the standards for what the building operates as. In other words, they set the temperatures and they set the time clocks and all the rest of that. That whole guide ends up changing a little bit, usually in most buildings, but that gives you the setup information. And that's part of the systems manual. And all of the training information, records, and all the rest of that, all of the commissioning information, all the rest of that goes into the systems manual. So you can see with all of that information, doing it electronically is about the only productive way to do that. But the people that are operating the building have to know where the systems manual is and how to get through it and how it's organized. Next. Functional performance testing in Chapter 10 requires generally accepted engineering standards. It's mandatory on the listed systems. So it lists in Chapter 10 on the functional performance testing in the green code. Here's the things, anything larger than that, you've got to commission. And there's the mandatory systems and functional and performance testing. Next. The functional performance testing requirements included in the construction documents and schedule. We've covered that a couple of times previously here, but again, they're emphasizing that the contractors, subcontractors, suppliers, and all the rest of that need to know what everybody expects at the end of the project. Prior to building permit, again, this is something that has been picked up by some building codes that designate the functional performance providers. In this case, maybe the owner's employees, independent commissioning folks, designers familiar with functional performance testing, independent of the design and construction. So again, list in the code here, this is how the folks must be selected. And it also requires in the code that the functional performance test providers and shall review all of these documents and be sure everything is putting in properly. And then they talk about requirements included in the construction documents and schedule. It's covered that. Next one, Ray, Randy. There you go. Construction plans for operation. Prior to building occupancy, these are the things that we talked about before. They're repeated from the previous energy code. Verify startup, perform the functional and performance testing of the systems that you're testing, verify that the O&M documents are there, provide complete design functional documentation. All of that goes to the owner, and then the documentation shall be retained. This is all in the code. Next. Building projects bigger than 10,000 square feet have to go through the entire commissioning process based on ASHRAE Standard 202 or generally accepted standards. Most everybody uses 202. The other commissioning organizations, and there are 3 other ones, basically use Standard 202 as their basic process. So commissioning process is included in the design and construction. Documents comply with the owner's project requirements and a BOD, and systems manual is assembled. So we're talking about basically the same thing here, construction plans and operations. Next. In Chapter 10, they have a list of systems to be commissioned. Again, air conditioning, air curtain systems, lighting, domestic water, water pumping, irrigation, renewable energy systems, if they're there, and energy and building management and demand control systems. All of those that are, all of these nowadays are all connected together. So that requires somebody to verify that in fact they are connected together and they operate properly. Next. And that defines here again in activities prior to permit. Again, it's redundant to some of the other documents we just went over. Develop commissioning plan. Owner has a commissioning provider with the background necessary, and all of those commissioning requirements included in the document. So this is a repetition of the things we just covered, but it's specifically mentioned in the Chapter 10 of IGCC. Next. Construction plans for operation. Can they get into more detail in the activities prior to building occupancy? Again, the same thing. Verify CX complete, including installation verification, that the owner has been provided all of this information. And if necessary, then it also goes to the AHJ. And then the systems manual is there and ready to go. Then the post-occupancy commissioning, again, we're talking about completing everything that wasn't done before and other things that may be added to it. Comply with the post-occupancy requirements for Standard 202, which has those requirements, and then update the commissioning reports in the systems manual so that everything's up to date at the end. Next. Preliminary commissioning report. performance commissioning. Again, we talked about the same process here. Commission equipment and systems, issues of regular, all of these things, and the things that you haven't tested yet, and get the training done that needs to be done to operate the building initially, and a plan for completion of the commissioning. What happens later? Next. Final commissioning report. The commissioning report is with updated systems manual per standard 202 is provided to the owner prior to project completion. The owner to retain systems manual and final commissioning report documents. Requires the owner of the building, and hopefully the owner will transfer that information to future owners when they get into, if the building is flipped, and the building retains the information required to operate it. Now, one of the questions you might ask is, with all of that stuff that the contractor has to do to satisfy all this, contractor is going to hate this process. Not really. Contractor understands, the ones that use commissioning all the time, understand that once a building is commissioned and all of the systems operate properly, and they're all signed off and all of the documentation is there, everybody agrees that it operates properly, everybody can go home, that they don't have to send people back to fix things for the next year. And that saves them money. All of their extra finish out money they can stick in their pocket. So contractors like good commissioning. Next. So other things, there's an Appendix K that is in the IGC that has a lot more information about commissioning. Again, provider qualification goes into a whole bunch of detail about performance and a type of equipment and certifications and the rest of that. There are 4 major national certifications available for commissioning providers. Then they talk about overview of the process, we've covered. So it talks about all of the deliverables and the rest of that in greater detail. So that's a good, if you get the whole of the IGCC, that Appendix K gives you a lot more information about commissioning. Next. This is a process, and I'm not going to go over this in great detail, but these are the things that we've been talking about. So what this particular table adds is we've got the activities from owner's project requirements through final CX report, and we've covered the deliverables. What are the documents? The things that's new on this one, who provides that? Normally provided by, in the case of the OPR, I talked about, is the owner with assistance from the design team. And then all the way down to the end of the final report is commissioning provider. So there is somebody responsible for each one of those documents. And it isn't always the commissioning provider. Could be the designers, could be the contractors, could be any number of folks. So that's a useful document of who's supposed to do what to whom. Next. So they also have some informative information on functional performance testing, documents, the description, and they have a list of contents for various things. And some of the checklists that we talked about earlier from the ICC document and the stakeholder guide document talks about what's in the owner's project requirements and all of the things listed there. This was what's supposed to be in them. There's a list in there for the checklist that has all of those, or at least a list of the documents that what's supposed to be in all of that. Next. So commissioning enforcement, particularly for the folks that work in the various areas that SPEAR looks at. The building officials have to figure out how to enforce that. It's in the code. And it's now a mandate, if decent sized buildings, if they got the energy code, and in Texas, that's a requirement that you have an energy code. If you have code systems that requires commissioning, and somehow you got to enforce that. But the AHJ needs some kind of assurance that it's being done, and it's being planned before the permit is issued. And the AHJ can request a copy of these things. Some of them can get pretty detailed. Sometimes the building official will rely on the approval of the owner, along with whatever permit requests they have to make, that they're saying that, yes, all of this information is available. Now, please give me the permit. So again, the things that they want to know is, you got a provider who's going to do this. All those documents in the construction documents, so the contractor knows he's got to do it. And that, do you have a commissioning plan that's going to look at all of that? Next. So in this case, again, we're talking about the green code here, but it applies to the energy code as well from a practical standpoint. So the code official looks at the code process, looks at the initial requirements to ensure that the commissioning has been included. And the commissioning plan needs to be written based on the owner's requirements and the designer's plans and assumptions. So all of that needs to be available and finished before you start the construction. That gives you your building permit. Next. Then the functions at the time of permit, owner needs to have selected that. And this is sort of a repetition. By the time the project completion, all of that has to be done. So you got a temporary and a final certificate of occupancy. Various different things are used in that process, but the trick there is to be sure that it's done to the extent that it can be done and that the building operates properly. And with the complications, as we discussed earlier, the complications of current buildings, such that you basically have to test it to be sure it operates. I don't know of a major project that we've done, the commissioning that we've walked into, and there wasn't anything that needed to be fixed. I don't remember a building in years in that case. So it's important that somebody looks at it and the current operations, and that it's done to the extent it needs to be done. Next. So the AHJ would then verify who's the commissioning provider. Are they approved? What systems are commissioned? And the things that, in this case, that we're talking about today, the energy systems, and by extension, the building air quality systems need to be commissioned. That the OPRs and the BOD have to be available and written. Commissioning plan is there, and then the reports are submitted for that process. Next. That the other things that need to be sure that they're included, a list of equipment to be commissioned. Who's looking at what? What are the requirements for that commission? How is it supposed to work? What is it supposed to do? What is the contractor supposed to do? Then you got to verify all of these system performances with the verification and testing, and then all the rest of that we've been talking about. So it gets a little bit redundant when we go over these things multiple times, but it's really important that all of these steps be covered. Next. In commissioning plan contents, not going to go over this in great detail, but this gives you a list of narrative process, and who does what are the documentation, and who sends what information to who, what kind of detailed description conditions, what kind of details do you need, and who ends up with that information, who provides it, who works with it, who reports on it. Then a list of measurable performance criteria. What are we looking at? All of that needs to be in the commissioning plan. Next. The commissioning plan contents, again, documentation submitted, all the rest of this that we've just covered, inspection checklist. The thing to note here is that the initial commissioning plan written during pre-design by the owner at the owner's project requirements would not have all of the testing forms and all of the criteria for performance, because that's not designed yet. All of that evolves. So the commissioning plan is an evolving document. It gets changed a bunch from beginning to end. So it has to include all of the things so that everybody knows what they've got to do. Inspections and what the suppliers have to provide, what the installing subcontractors have to do, and all the procedures that you use in order to get all of this to happen. All of that needs to be in that commissioning plan. Next. So code commissioning checklist for permit. It's an interesting thing is this could be used for permit application. In other words, you have to have this information as part of the documents that are needed in order to get the permit. It lists the information that are required by the building official. This is going to be a combination of the design information and the commissioning requirements. Again, it could be used for a number of things, including controls and scheduling. Next. This is an example of some such form. Commissioning documentation for permit. Again, on the top, it identifies project, who the provider is, who the how to get a hold of them, what their certification is if required. But it includes things that include permit number that'll be there eventually once they get the permit. Then it includes things that need to be looked at. In other words, are the commissioning requirements, somebody has to approve the fact before permit that the requirements are there. Contractor instructions are available to the contractor. The design review has been done. Commissioning plan has been written. Quite often that's revised or approved by the commissioning provider and our owner, because in the bottom you'll see that the commissioning provider signs it and the owner signs it. Next. But if you go back to the energy code, it's got a similar checklist. It's in the code. It includes the project information and name, where it is, who the commissioning authority is. But what this checklist does is it verifies that things are done. Not particularly documentation, but it verifies what has been done as far as completion. It talks about test and balance done. HVAC equipment functional testing is executed, and that the controls function has been verified and is provided that the testing is scheduled on. They're talking about testing is scheduled here. Quite often this is used for completion. Next. That's the second half of this form. Functional performance testing executed. And follow-up testing is scheduled on if necessary. Lighting controls, service water heating, systems manuals done, commissioning report preliminary is done, and then owner's rep is the one that certifies it, that all of this stuff is done. Certify that the provider has provided me with the evidence of all of this stuff. So it's a very functional document. And it's the difference in the 19 and the 21 energy code forms are not much different. So next. Again, going back to IGCC Appendix K, final commissioning report, basically what we talked about, delivered to the owner, is not required for the building official unless they particularly want to see it. And in some cases, in government buildings, university buildings, and the stuff, sometimes the folks in charge of the building approval want to have copies of that or have access to it. And then these are the same things that the final commissioning report. It lists things here that we've been talking about. Tests, what the results, what happened, what was fixed, what wasn't fixed. Next. And then Appendix K again talks about who does commissioning. Again, we're talking about independence, experience, equipment, personnel, all the rest of that in order to be sure that it's commissioned properly. Next. Again, independence. Again, we're talking about objective, competent. In other words, the commissioning provider has to be totally independent. Has to be sure that they're independent of the contractor. They're not responsible for the design or the installation. In fact, seldom do commissioning providers ever adjust or touch anything. They have the contractor or the supplier there that actually does the testing and demonstrates the performance of the equipment or the controls. Talks about no conflicts of interest. This is, you want to be sure that you get independent objectivity on these things, and the owner gets something that actually works. Next. Experience should have a bunch of previous buildings that you've done, previous equipment that you've done, and it's usually there as a team. The provider must have completed, in this case, in the code, it says a minimum of 2 projects of equal or larger scope, demonstrate adequate experience and training. All the rest of that needs to be available as far as evidence, as far as information for the owner and the building official if needed. Next. The next part of they talked about is provider must have the equipment, perform the required commissioning, functional and performance testing of activities. They got to have the equipment to test this. Quite often, or in fact, usually, that equipment is provided by the testing and balancing folks or the providers of the equipment. And that testing, that those instruments have to be calibrated and evidence for calibration. So that is accepted by the commissioning provider. And then it has to be periodically calibrated, as is always the case of instruments. Go ahead, next. Again, we're talking about approved provider, experienced personnel, experienced providers or supervisors, and things that have people that are used to evaluating these tests and inspections. And sometimes requires licenses and certifications, particularly if you're talking about elevators, fire protection systems. They have other requirements that you have to meet certain licensing requirements to do some of these other systems. And that those particular inspectors for that particular systems are then provide information to the commissioning provider to include in the commissioning report if those systems are part of the set of systems that have to be commissioned. Next. The commissioning certification we've talked about several times. There's an ISO standard 17024, which basically sets the requirements for certification for professionals for something like this. That standard requires there's about 5 different certifications that the NREP folks have included, and that are now certified, that are done per national standards or international standards. Next. Now, the other thing to realize and to understand, and think after all of this explanation, that commissioning is a team. It's not an individual. Having someone come in and walk through the building and say, yeah, it works, and leave, that doesn't provide functionality, doesn't provide assurance. So on the left-hand side here, there's a list of folks that are normally part of this team. And the commissioning provider is the one that supervises that and coordinates that. So you got the general contractor, which is one of the principal players in this, and you got his subs and the installers and the manufacturers, suppliers, and sometimes program administrators for sustainability programs. On the other side, you got the owner developer, certainly he's the one that's paying for all of this, the commissioning provider, and then the design team, architects, engineers, designers, and certainly the code officials are all part of the commissioning team. They all have to work together and they all have to communicate. And one of the things that is sort of, should be obvious, that the term commissioning and communication starts with the same letters. And that's both of them. Commissioning, you can't do commissioning without communication. So that's very vital to that process. Next. So I'll go over this real quick. The summary of commissioning process management. Owner selects the team, selects who's supposed to do what, develops what he wants in the building, the owner's project requirements, sends that to the design team. They use the OPR and other necessary discussions to develop the basis of design or how they're going to design it. And then the design team uses those requirements to specify commissioning requirements and do the detailed design of all of the stuff that goes into the building and the building itself. Commissioning provider develops commissioning plan, and as it goes along the commissioning checklists, the commissioning provider performs design and document reviews, again, trying to help out there to be sure that that things go into the design and are utilized that appear that are going to work. Next, the commissioning provider and project team expand the checklists and work with the general contractor and the subcontractors on timing and on inspections and all the rest of that. And then the contractors, subs, and manufacturers go through all of that information, provide other information, do the start up of the testing. And then all of those assemblies are interconnected, and they verifies performance at the near the end, and goes through all of the things that end up all of the information that you need for the final reports and for the systems manual. Commissioning team uses checklists to summarize documentation and create certificate of occupancy and ongoing commissioning process, and the owner approves all of that. Next. Discussion. Randy, we got any questions?
No, I don't, but that's a lot of information to unpack, and I see now going through all of this, it's quite parallel to, I know it's a mini version with residential, but it's kind of the same thing with asking for and making sure service manuals, operation manuals are next to the kitchen stove, in a drawer all together. The third parties are doing verification testing. At the end, you're getting certification. I mean, that's a lot. And if you're a city that's not asking for commissioning plans on commercial projects from the beginning at time of permit, I'd highly recommend that you do, because this is kind of, I guess it would be your litmus test to say, are they set up to do this and have they planned for this kind of action? Because Jerry, I know you can talk about it. If you get to the end and someone says, I need X, Y, and Z, and it wasn't part of the design process or planning, trying to go back and retro do that is kind of a whole lot more difficult.
Yeah. Next slide, it has my contact information on it, I think. That's me. If anybody has any questions, that's my email address, and that will send me an email, and I'll respond, let you know what information, or let you know that I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot to that. And again, I understand why now. There's a lot of times, I know building officials are busy. I know you guys have limited time on site. I know that a lot of this stuff comes up, and it's, as you said multiple times over, it's getting more complex. The buildings are more complex. It's harder to verify. It's harder to make sure that things are operating properly. Just because things are there and installed doesn't mean it's actually meeting the requirement and intent of the code, because it's not running efficiently. Or, as you said, Jerry, they're not interconnected.
Right.
So things are not functioning as it should. And as you and I found out yesterday at the North Texas Facilities Expo, there are companies that do retro. In other words, if a building has a change of use, or if someone just takes over the building and decides, I need to recommission this to make sure it functions properly and efficiently, there are companies out there that can do it.
Right.
So that's a lot of good information, Jerry. I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. I'm going to see if I can swap this. And that's my contact information. If you guys want to take a picture of that, you can, and just help us reach out to as many as we can. If there's cities on here that need help with adoption or questions, or I've got people in my team that can help, like Jerry, which I forward questions to him a lot and say, I have a CBO that's asking a question. How do we do this? What's the right process for this? He gives me the experience he has in this industry for decades, and says, this is how we would handle it. This is how he's worked with other cities or other project managers or design teams to get it going, and what they should look out to do. But as we see always, there's a lot of forms that are required. There's a lot of reports that are required. There's plan of actions that are required. We can't recommend enough that you guys ask for that at beginning of permit stage, and ask for what their plan of commissioning is, their plan of testing, who's their third party, where's their energy reports. All of this meets the energy code, and then commissioning it makes sure that it continues to meet energy code compliance for years until something changes, something gets replaced, or someone takes over and changes use of building. So
Well,
Jerry,
just
thank you so much for
or
your
just
information and time.
one other quick thing
Yep.
that might be helpful to folks. Uh, the permitting process, well, we find at least in Dallas area, is every city's permit process is different.
Yep.
And how do you figure out what the requirement is? And normally what we do too is go to the website for that city. And there's a couple of them that are really good at providing the information, and it references, connects to codes, connects to a bunch of things that they use in that city. So what we use, and I'm like, can I mention one of them that I think is one of the best ones, or should we not?
Yeah, for sure.
McKinney
Yes.
has one of the best websites that provides the permitting and licensing and all the rest of that information. They've
Very
got
good.
a really good website. There's some other ones that are good too, but McKinney's one of the best ones that I'm on these websites all the time to figure out which code issue you're looking at.
Yeah, there's people that will reach out to me, and if they're from out of state, a lot of times I'll kind of do the legwork for them. I'll go to the city's website, I'll find the code of ordinances, I'll go to their written code of ordinances, I'll read the amendments, I'll read the adoption, and then if I need to, I'll call out to the plan reviewers or permit tech or a building official and say, "Can you help me answer these questions so I can get some information back to someone that has reached out to us either through our technical assistant Seco, calling me or working with that or sending me an email." So I try to help navigate that so it doesn't bother a lot of the, you don't just bog it down at time of permit and someone says, "I didn't know I needed to do this." It's, let's walk through this first. But you're absolutely right. There's some progressive cities out there that have made sure they've put these things in play. And if you weren't part of my webinar last time, we did one just 2 weeks ago on energy code success for the building departments. I'm getting a lot of good feedback with some cities reaching out to me going, "We need your help. This is a great way of plan of attack for adoption, and then also compliance and enforcement." And I'm happy to help anybody that's on the call, or if you want to send it to somebody, you can. I appreciate it, Jerry, for all the time and information that you had for us today. As always, this is recorded. It's going to be loaded up on the YouTube channel within a few days. So